I will draw your attention to a videotape. What you'll be looking at here is the Sunday Times chief sports reporter, David Walsh, who uncovered the Lance Armstrong doping scandal. Here he's talking about lessons for horse racing and all of that. The interview was conducted in February. It was courtesy of Channel 4 Racing in France program Morning Line. We'll have a look at the video.
No man knows more about doping in sport than my guest this morning, David Walsh from the Sunday Times, a four-time Sports Writer of the Year, garlanded heavily, of course, for his work on the Tour de France and particularly on Lance Armstrong. Great to have you with us here on the Morning Line, David. Has racing got a serious problem to worry about, in your opinion?
Yeah, I would say it has. I mean, there's been lots of murmurings within racing down through the years. I was at Gordon Park recently, and an old pal of mine who goes racing all the time, you know, cornered me and said, you know, this sport has a problem, you should be looking at it. Now, my feeling about racing is, and I've discussed this with officials, I say, you don't test horses that are deemed out of training if they've got an injury. And I said, but isn't that the logical time that you might build a horse back up with performance-enhancing drugs? Anabolic steroids are really good at rebuilding muscle. So if a horse is injured, it's a time you would seriously, you know, want to be testing him. Similarly, I've had this feeling about yearlings. Yearlings are not deemed to be in training, therefore they're not tested. Now, if you were building up a horse to try and give him a head start as a 2-year-old, maybe anabolic steroids for yearlings would be a big thing. And to me, if you say we're not testing, and you know, out of horses that are deemed out of training, we're not testing yearlings. It's like saying it's okay to do stuff in those two situations.
So you feel there's a tacit acceptance on the part of the authorities? That
yes,
it's acceptable in some cases.
So, Paul Batar, what do you make of that?
Well, David's views are to be respected. I mean, he's an incredibly well-credentialed guy when it comes to that sort of issue, and he is a genuine fan of the sport, so putting that in context. In terms of Britain, I don't think there's the specific issue or problem within the sport that he talks about, and certainly our benchmarking of our results in terms of positive tests compares it benchmarks quite well against other jurisdictions. So we have no reason to believe that there's, you know, a proliferation or a widespread use of anabolic steroids in the sport, albeit we have had a couple of very high-profile cases in the last 18 months.
And Louis Romanet, what would you say? I take on board everything that you've already had to say, but Walsh seems to be implying there that the authorities lack conviction.
I'm sorry.
No, Louis.
We can hear the question.
Yeah.
We couldn't hear the question.
He seems to be saying there that the authorities lack conviction, that you're not committed enough to putting an end to this.
Who is not committed enough? No, I think we are all committed. I think I want to be very straight. Every meeting we have, we raise the concern of the integrity of racing and of what should be done. Personally, my family has been involved in horse racing administration for more than 100 years. The first decision to disqualify horses for doping were taken in 1912. We had no testing at that time. It was just on a declaration of stable employees that recognized that they had given some product to the horses. Since that, we've been investing year after year. For example, in France, we started control of horses in training in 1995, nearly 20 years ago. We started to test horses out of competition in 2002. We will be starting this year in 2014 to test horses at stud, when the rules of racing will have been modified with the agreement of the Ministry of Agriculture. We are spending 10 million euros in France for doping control. So how can you say it's not one of our priorities? It is, but as was said about sport, the problem is the labs are producing new medications on a permanent basis for humans, and every time you have something for humans, somebody is trying them for horses. So we are doing the best we can. We cannot guarantee anything at 100%, but the sensitivity we have, the quality of our technicians, when you're listening to people like Terry Wan in Hong Kong, like Yves Bonner in Paris, they know what they're talking about. And I think they are doing better than human labs. I don't want to criticize human labs, but with the money we invest in anti-doping research, I think we are at the highest level of control than the sports is. And I remember the first Group 1 winner that was tested positive for steroids was in France. Many, many years ago, 5 years before Ben Johnson was positive. While looking at Ben Johnson, you were knowing he was on steroids for many years.
And Andrew Harding, from the point of view of the Asian Racing Federation, what would you say to that?
Look, I think it has to be recognised that when it comes to racing, the jurisdictions that are more integrated have an easier job of it. That's certainly true in economics, it's true in integrity. And that problem's even more compounded if you've got a federal system. So in Asia, we are reasonably fortunate in terms of the models that we have. And with those models, I do think we're ahead of the game. And I say that for this reason. If you look at the incidence of positive samples, there are overwhelmingly cases of legitimate therapeutics and the withdrawal time has been miscalculated or the contaminated feed. The incidence of, the bad drugs, the performance-enhancing drugs, is truly low. Now, Pericles might say, you test a lot, you don't find much, maybe you're not able to find it, maybe it's there. But I don't think that's true of racing, certainly not racing in Asia, and I say that for this reason, because of all of those things that he pointed to as the other strategies that you need to have in place, we have those. We have had those for some time. Louis pointed to France's record on out-of-competition testing. In Hong Kong and in Singapore, that's just a feature of the way the industry is structured. But in Australia, which is largely decentralised, we introduced out-of-competition testing 10 years ago. We're investing in the research that's necessary to stay ahead of the game. And take Australia as the example a bit further. They're going a bit further again. They're saying, we're going to define the career of the racehorse from birth. And from birth to retirement, the horse has to be traceable. It has to be available for testing. So I would say to the proposition that David Walsh puts, that in the case of racing, certainly racing in Asia, it's not true. And I think it's demonstrable that we do have the courage of our convictions.
And Jim, what would you say as it applies to the United States?
Well, as Andrew said, there's some jurisdictions around the world that enjoy a federal system, a centralized authority. In the United States, we don't have such a thing. We have 38 different states that regulate racing in a separate basis. In cases like recently the poor publicity that came out from the Asmussen tapes, that only highlighted that we have inconsistencies in our rules and our standards in our labs throughout the United States, and that further galvanizes our spirit to improve our standing in the United States. We've done so in a number of ways through the Jockey Club. Back in 2011, we published the standard, which is called the Reformed Racing Medication Rules, which has become our platform for advocacy, pointing towards the best penalties, the best rules, the best lab standards, and finally, improved investigations of violations.
Do you concede, though, with the Asmussen case, it took animal rights campaigners to effectively set a trap and to catch a trainer and to expose cheating in some cases, but also cruelty? Do you accept that it took that? And how damaging will that be?
Well, I won't pass judgment on what we saw, other than that we certainly all witnessed a lot of coarse language and some potential for violations, but we'll leave that to the authorities and in the investigations. Clearly, our game is a game that requires the consumer confidence and trust that we're taking care of the horse in the best way that we can. The research that we did back in 2011 put at the very top of the priorities for the sustainability of the sport is the welfare of the horse. So videos like that certainly affect the perception of the sport, and while we think that was an anomaly, we take it very seriously.
And what are the prospects of federal legislation dealing with this?
That's a tough question. Someone told me the last Congress, the last U.S. Congress, of all the bills that were introduced during that session, only 3% passed. So having a federal bill is passed and made into law. It's not an easy process to begin with in the United States. But I see more and more stakeholders in the industry interested in a federal solution. Clearly, in the United States, horse racing, by the virtue of it being simulcasting, it is an interstate business. So there is some thought within our industry that federal legislation would make the most sense. The Jockey Club will support any measure that will see those uniform rules applied, the right penalties and the right standards for labs. We've been working with those 38 states, and if time should come for us to work with federal authorities, we'd be pleased to do so.
And Pericles, are you in a position to say, compare one sport to another in terms of how they do respond to this issue? It's been said that racing feels as if they're out in front of the others. Are you able to make judgments on that?
Well, unfortunately, I cannot really make a judgment on it, but I have to say almost every federation claims that they are pretty much ahead of all the other ones in fighting doping. I think that's almost in the nature of the situation. But to be honest, I could imagine that race horsing is indeed ahead in terms of a very important issue, which is a conflict of interests, for example. In humans, we have the problem that politics was involved for a very long time. So we even had the Eastern German political situation with pressure on athletes to dope. And it was even applied to them without them knowing. And in Western Germany, it was a very high indirect pressure, so they had to do it in a way. I don't think that such systematic issues matter here, but it's certainly the money involved. And good news is money doesn't really matter because it's all about glory. We know from certain sports that like rowing, where athletes merely are able to live on what they get from the sports, but nevertheless doping is an issue. So what I think is horse racing should keep a skepticism about the efficacy of the anti-doping system. That's very important. And to have a very close look at the data that are available and to see whether out-of-competition testing really makes a difference is one option. Another option would be to compare the efficacy of different anti-doping federations, different national approaches. I very much like the approach that has been presented today from, I think it was Korea, is it correct? The Korean Federation. And I think then take the best of all of it. And I really think that most of the people like to see integrity in sports and that those guys involved in trying to deal with it do their best job. But like in the industry, we have to decide where the money needs to go to. What is the most effective way to keep the integrity in horse racing?
Lance Armstrong cheated for a very long time. Why did it take so long to catch him?
Well, they caught him because of an extraordinary effort, which wouldn't have been made in any other athlete on the world, on the planet, most likely. So I wouldn't think that they would have ever catched him if it wasn't Lance Armstrong. And it wasn't because of testing. It was because of investigations. And why did it take such a long time? Well, you only need a second or third level doctor, maybe a major of business administration like in Austria. That was the guy who doped all the Austrian athletes for a longer period of time without them being detected, is all you need. You don't need a specialist. So Fuentes is a gynecologist, and he has been effectively doping a lot of elite athletes over several years. And unfortunately, we have to keep in mind, even though attempts like the ones taken by Mr. Bonaire are exceptional, and very, very profound work has been done in a laboratory. We need to be critical about what we can achieve by just putting our attempts into the laboratory. And we also, there we have to decide what is the right ratio of funding science versus funding testing itself.
Now, Andrew?
I think it's a relevant point of distinction between racing and other sports, for example cycling, that because we are gambling related, have been since our inception, we are and always have been hyper conscious about integrity. And that's led us to build networks and frameworks to ensure integrity, including intelligence, the use of intelligence. I mean, the dogs were barking for a very long time that there was something wrong with Lance Armstrong. And if you had that repeated in racing, then you'd be able to call upon all of that framework that's in place in terms of our stewards, working with our laboratories and our integrity officers. And I think I'm not saying that we necessarily would have succeeded where they failed, but I think we are much better geared for success.
Now, I'm conscious that we're almost out of time, and I think, as I understand it, the buses leave for the social event in about half an hour, which doesn't give people a lot of time. But is there a contribution that somebody wants to make by way of summary based on the discussions we've had? I don't want to leave anybody frustrated that they haven't had an opportunity to make a point. Anybody?
I'm fine.
All happy? Now, Mr. Chairman, I know that you would like to draw attention to a conference, a very important conference related to this later on this year in Mauritius.
Oh, okay. Thank you so much for taking this opportunity. I just want to remind the racing authorities, people who can make decisions. Practically, there will be a conference, international conference called ICRAB. It's a conference for racing analysts and veterinarians. It will take place in Mauritius this September. It's a place where analysts and veterinarians can acquire update of doping agents, testing methods, or like injury prevention, welfare issues, what's necessary for the racing authorities. So for the racing authorities, please send vets and chemists to that conference, and please fund them so that they could make a contribution. And that's what I want to remind. And can I have another comment to Korea? I just want to congratulate the KRA for taking a big step. Because this is an Asian conference, it's very important for like small Asian countries or developing countries to take an international step. So I understand even Korea has just adopted one single phonexamegamin drug to adopt an Asian screening limit, but I know that it was a very big step, so I'd like to congratulate that, and we would welcome any other countries who want to participate in international racing, because in the ARF website and in the IFHA website, there's a screening limit. It's very simply stated, so please refer to that as well. Thank you.